Evening, Chib. Today is the 15th of May 2020. Today we did reading because still COVID time, so not really leaving the house much, but that was nice to do reading with you. It's the slime book. And we saw how Jemima was going to plan to do big bad things to Ned with all those things in the jars. And we also watched some more Paw Patrol, which you enjoyed doing. You did little smiles, which was nice to see. And we talked about whether or not to get you a football, and you said no, I don't want a football. Iranai tokadatte. Which was a bit sad because Ator likes football, and he likes to watch Liverpool play. You probably remember that. And when I was a little boy, I was about your age when I started enjoying playing it, and I don't think you're going to start playing football really by the sounds of the way you were talking. But I wanted to get you a football because I wanted to get you to do some exercise. But obviously, if you don't like football, then you don't have to. It's always your choice. But it would be good to try and find something that you do like to do so you can get out and get some fresh air and feel happy and healthy after doing some exercise. Okay, well, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, on the phone in the future. Yeah, okay, well, here we go. We're nearly at the end. If I remember rightly, this chapter is about to start with Mr. Jenkins and his son being reunited after Bruno has become a mouse. Here we go. Okay, so chapter 19, I believe. Mr. Jenkins and his son. Mr. Jenkins came striding up to our table with a very purposeful look on his face. "Where is that grandson of yours?" he said to my grandmother. He spoke rudely and looked very angry. My grandmother put on her frostiest look but didn't answer him. "My guess is that he and my son, Bruno, are up to some devilment," Mr. Jenkins went on. "Bruno hasn't turned up for his supper, and it takes a lot to make that boy miss his food." "I must admit he has a very healthy appetite," my grandmother said. "My feeling is that you're in on this as well," Mr. Jenkins said. "I don't know who the devil you are, and I don't much care, but you played a nasty trick on me and my wife this afternoon. You put a dirty little mouse on the table. That makes me think all three of you are up to something. So, if you know where Bruno's hiding, kindly tell me at once." "That was no trick I played on you," my grandmother said. "That mouse I tried to give you was your own little boy Bruno. I was being kind to you. I was trying to restore him to the bosom of his family. You refused to take him." "What the blazes do you mean, madam?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. "My son isn't a mouse." His black moustache was jumping up and down like crazy as he spoke. "Come on, woman, where is he? Out with it." The family at the table nearest to us had all stopped eating and were staring at Mr. Jenkins. My grandmother sat there puffing away calmly at her black cigar. "I can't well understand your anger, Mr. Jenkins," she said. "Any other English father would be just as cross as you are. But over in Norway, where I come from, we are quite used to these sorts of happenings. We have learnt to accept them as part of everyday life." "You must be mad, woman," cried Mr. Jenkins. "Where is Bruno? If you don't tell me at once, I shall summon the police." "Bruno is a mouse," my grandmother said, calm as ever. "He most certainly is not a mouse," shouted Mr. Jenkins. "Oh, yes, I am," Bruno said, poking his head out of the handbag. Mr. Jenkins leapt about 3 feet into the air. That's about 1 metre. "Hello, Dad," Bruno said. He had a silly sort of mousy grin on his face. Mr. Jenkins' mouth dropped open so wide I could see the gold fillings in his back teeth. "Don't worry, Dad," Bruno went on. "It's not as bad as all that, just so long as the cat doesn't get me." But Bruno," stammered Mr. Jenkins. "No more school," said Bruno, grinning a broad and asinine mouse grin. "No more homework. I shall live in..." Here we go. Oh my goodness. "The kitchen cupboard and feast on raisins and honey." But Bruno," stammered Mr. Jenkins again. "How did this happen?" The poor man had no wind left in his sails at all. "Witches," my grandmother said. "The witches did it." I can't have a mouse for a son, shrieked Mr. Jenkins. You've got one, my grandmother said. Be nice to him, Mr. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins will go crazy, yelled Mr. Jenkins. She can't stand the things. She'll just have to get used to him, my grandmother said. I hope you don't keep a cat in the house. We do, cried Mr. Jenkins. Topsy is my wife's favourite creature. Then you'll just have to get rid of Topsy, my grandmother said. Your son is more important than your cat. He certainly is, Bruno shouted from inside the handbag. You tell Mum she's got to get rid of Topsy before I go home. By now the dining room was watching our little group. Knives and forks and spoons had been put down, and all over the place heads were turning round to stare at Mr. Jenkins as he stood there spluttering and shouting. They couldn't see either Bruno or me, and they were wondering what all the fuss was about. By the way, my grandmother said, would you like to know who did this to them? There was a mischievous little smile on her face, and I could see that she was about to get Mr. Jenkins into trouble. Who? He cried. Who did it? That woman over there, my grandmother said. The small one in the black dress at the head of the long table. She's RSPCC, cried Mr. Jenkins. She's the chairwoman. No, she's not, my grandmother said. She's the Grand High Witch of all the world. Oh, what's going to happen? Can't get this thing. You mean she did it, that little skinny woman over there? You mean she did it, that skinny little woman over there? Shouted Mr. Jenkins, pointing at her with the long finger. By gad, I'll have my lawyers onto her for this. I'll make her pay through the nose. I wouldn't do anything rash, my grandmother said to him. That woman has magic powers. She might decide to turn you into something even sillier than a mouse, a cockroach perhaps. Turn me into a cockroach, shouted Mr. Jenkins, puffing out his chest. I'd like to see her try. He swung around and started marching across the dining room towards the Grand High Witch's table. My grandmother and I watched him. Bruno had jumped up onto our table and was also watching his father. Practically everyone in the dining room was watching Mr. Jenkins now. I stayed where I was, peeping out of my grandmother's bag. I thought it might be wiser to stay put. What's going to happen, Hugo? Here we go. Triumph. Mr. Jenkins had not gone more than a few paces towards the Grand High Witch's table when a piercing scream rose high above all the other noises in the room, and at the same moment I saw the Grand High Witch shooting up into the air. Now she was standing on her chair, still screaming. Now she was on the tabletop, waving her arms. What on earth happening, Grandmama? Wait, my grandmother said. Keep quiet and watch. Suddenly all the other witches, more than 80 of them, were beginning to scream and jump out of their seats as though spikes were being stuck into their bottoms. Some of them were standing on chairs, some were up on tables, and all of them were wiggling about and waving their arms in the most extraordinary manner. Then, all at once, they became quiet. Then they stiffened. Every single witch stood there as stiff and as silent as a corpse. The room became deathly ill. They're shrinking, Grandmama, I said. They're shrinking just like I did. I know they are, my grandmother said. It's the mouse maker, I cried. Look, some of them are growing fur on their faces. Why is it? They've done it, Hugo. I can't turn the page. Look. Oh my goodness. Oh no, look. Ah, look at that one. Tail. Oh no, they're all shrinking. Ah! Why is it working so quickly, Grandma? I tell you why, my grandmother said, because all of them have had a massive overdoses, just like you. It's thrown the alarm clock right out of whack. Everyone in the dining room was standing up now to get a better view. People were moving close. They were beginning to crowd round the two long tables. Look at all these... It's very strange, isn't it? What's going on with that one? Look. Looks like another eye, but it's just a nose, but with funny holes. My grandmother lifted Bruno and me up so that we wouldn't miss any of the fun. In her excitement, she jumped up onto her chair so that she could see over the heads of the crowds. In another few seconds, all the witches had completely disappeared, and the tops of the 2 long tables were swarming with small brown mice. All over the dining room women were screaming, and strong men were turning white in the face and shouting, "It's crazy, this can't happen. Let's get the heck out of here, quick." Waiters were attacking the mice with chairs and wine bottles and anything that they could come to hand. I saw a chef in a tall white hat rushing out from the kitchen, brandishing a frying pan. Good Lord. Oh, look, Hugo. They're all jumping off the table, all running away. Quick, quick, quick. And another one just behind him was wielding a carving knife above his head, and everyone was yelling, "Mice, mice, mice! We must get rid of the mice!" Only the children in the room were really enjoying it. They all seemed to know instinctively that something good was going on right in front of them, and they were clapping and cheering and laughing like mad. "It's time to go," my grandmother said. "Our work is done." She got down off her chair and picked up her handbag and slung it over her arm. She had me in her right hand and Bruno in her left. "Bruno," she said, "the time has come to restore you to the famous bosom of your family." "My mum's not very crazy about mice," Bruno said. "So I noticed," my grandmother said. "She'll just have to get used to it, won't she?" It was not difficult to find Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. You could hear Mrs. Jenkins' shrill voice all over the room. "Herbert!" it was screaming. "Herbert, get me out of here! There's mice everywhere. They'll go up my skirts." She had her arms up high around her husband, and from where I was, she seemed to be swinging from his neck. My grandmother advanced upon them and thrust Bruno into Mr. Jenkins' head. "Here's your little boy," she said. "He needs to go on a diet." "Hi, Dad," Bruno said. "Hi, Mum," Mrs. Jenkins screamed even louder. My grandmother, with me in her hand, turned and marched out of the room. She went straight across the hotel lobby and out through the front window into the open air. Outside it was a lovely warm evening, and I could hear the waves breaking on the beach just across the road from the hotel. "Is there a taxi here?" my grandmother said to the tall doorman in his green uniform. "Certainly, madam," he said, and he put 2 fingers into his mouth and blew a long shrill whistle. I watched him with envy. For weeks I had been trying to whistle like that, but I hadn't succeeded. Now I never would. He's doing that cuckoo whistle. There's Grandma and there's the little boy. The taxi came. The driver was an oldish man with a thick black drooping moustache. The moustache hung over his mouth like the roots of some plant. "Where to, madam?" he asked. Suddenly he caught sight of me, a little mouse nestling in my grandmother's hand. "Blimey," he said. "What's that?" "It's my grandson," my grandmother said. "Drive us to the station, please." "I always liked mice," the old taxi driver said. "I used to keep hundreds of them when I was a boy. Mice is the fastest breeders in the world. Did you know that, Mum? So, if he's your grandson, then I reckon you'll have a few great grandsons to go on. I'm a couple of times, and then I reckon you'll be having a few great grandsons to go with him in a couple of weeks' time." "Drive us to the station, please," my grandmother said, looking for him. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "right away." My grandmother got into the back of the taxi and sat down and put me on her lap. "Are we going home?" I asked. "Yes," she answered, "back to Norway." "Hooray!" I cried. "Oh, hooray, hooray, hooray!" "I thought you'd like that," she said. "What about our luggage?" "Who cares about our luggage?" she said. The taxi was driving through the streets of Bournemouth, and this was the time of day when the pavements were crowded with holiday makers, all wandering about aimlessly with nothing to do. "How are you feeling, my darling?" my grandmother said. "Fine," I said. "Quite marvellous." She began stroking the fur on the back of my neck with one finger. "We have accomplished great feats today," she said. "It's been terrific," I said. "Absolutely terrific." Right, I have time for one more chapter. The Heart of a Mouse is the next chapter. Wonder what's going on here. Look at this. What's up there? Table, I guess. There's some sort of mouse trap thingy there by the looks of things. Let's read. What's on that picture? It's a view of some sort. Okay, The Heart of a Mouse. It was lovely to be back in Norway once again in my grandmother's fine old house. But now that I was so small, everything looked different and it took me quite a while to find my way around. Mine was a world of carpets and table legs and chair legs and the little crannies behind large pieces of furniture. A closed door could not be opened and nothing could be reached that was on a table. But after a few days, my grandmother began to invent gadgets for me in order to make life a bit easier. She got a carpenter to put together a number of slim, tall step ladders that she placed one of these against each table in the house so that I could climb up whenever I wanted. She herself invented a wonderful door opening device made out of wires and springs and pulleys with heavy weights dangling on cords, and soon every door in the house had a door opener on it. All I had to do was press my front paws on a tiny wooden platform and hey presto, a spring would stretch and a weight would drop and the door would swing open. That must be what that is then. Next, she rigged up an equally ingenious system where I could switch on the light whenever I entered a room at night. I cannot explain how it worked because I know nothing about electricity, but there was a little button let into the floor near the door in every room in the house. What's going on here? Oh, that looks nice. Is he brushing his teeth? And when I pressed the button gently with one paw, the light would come on. When I pressed it a second time, the light would go off again. My grandmother made me a tiny toothbrush using a matchstick for the handle, and into this she stuck little bits of bristle that she had snipped off from her hairbrush. You must not get any holes in your teeth, she said. I can't take a mouse to a dentist. He'd think I was crazy. It's funny, I said, but ever since I became a mouse, I've hated the taste of sweets and chocolate, so I don't think I'll get any holes. You are still going to brush your teeth after every meal, my grandmother said, and I did. Oh, looks nice. Best friends. For a bathtub, she gave me a silver sugar basin, which is that one. And I bathed in it every night before going to bed. She allowed no one else into the house, not even a servant or a cook. We kept entirely to ourselves, and we were very happy in each other's company. One evening, as I lay on my grandmother's lap in front of the fire, she said to me, I wonder what happened to that little Bruno. I wouldn't be surprised if his father gave him to the hall porter to drown in the fire bucket, I answered. I'm afraid you might be right, my grandmother said. The poor little thing. We were silent for a few minutes, my grandmother puffing away at her black cigar while I dozed comfortably in the warmth. Can I ask something, Grandmama? I said. Ask me anything you like, my darling. How long does a mouse live? Ah, she said, I've been waiting for you to ask me that. There was silence. She sat there smoking away, gazing at the fire. Well, I said, how long do we live, us mice? I have been reading about mice, she said. I have been trying to find out everything I can about them. Go on then, Grandmama. Why don't you tell me? If you really want to know, she said, I'm afraid a mouse doesn't live for a very long time. How long? I asked. Well, an ordinary mouse only lives for about 3 years, she said. But you are not an ordinary mouse. You are a mouse person. That is a very different matter. How different, I asked. How long does a mouse person live, Grandmama? Longer, she said. Much longer. A mouse person will almost certainly live for 3 times as long as an ordinary mouse, my grandmother said. About 9 years. Good, I cried. That's great. It's the best news I've ever had. Why do you say that? She asked, surprised. Because I would never want to live longer than you, I said. I couldn't stand being looked after by anybody else. Ah. It's still short, but it's a nice thing to say. There was a short silence. She had a way of fondling me behind the ears with the tip of one finger. It felt lovely. How old are you, Grandmama? I asked. I'm 86, she said. Will you live another 8 or 9 years? I might, she said, with a bit of luck. You've got to, I said, because by then I'll be a very old mouse, and you'll be a very old grandmother, and soon after that we'll both die together. That would be perfect, she said. I had a little doze after that. I just shut my eyes and thought of nothing and felt at peace with the world. Would you like me to tell you something about yourself that is very interesting? My grandmother said. Yes, please, Grandmama, I said, without opening my eyes. I couldn't believe it at first, but apparently it's quite true, she said. What is it? I asked. The heart of a mouse, she said, and that means your heart is beating at a rate of 500 times a minute. Isn't that amazing? That's not possible, I said, opening my eyes wide. It's true, as I'm sitting here, she said. It's a sort of miracle. That's nearly 9 beats every second, I cried, working out in my head. Correct, she said. Your heart is going so fast, it's... impossible to hear the separate beats. All one hears is a soft humming sound. Oh, look at that picture. That's beautiful, isn't it? Tomodachi and also Mago-san and Grandma. Oba-san, Oba-jan. She was wearing a lace dress and the lace kept tickling my nose. I had to rest my head on my front paws. Have you ever heard my heart humming away, Grandmama? I asked her. Often, she said. I hear it when you are lying very close to me on the pillow at night. The two of us remained silent in front of the fire for a long time after that, thinking about these wonderful things. My darling, she said at last, are you sure you don't mind being a mouse for the rest of your life? I don't mind at all, I said. It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like, so long as somebody loves you. Ah. It's off to work we go. How many more chapters are there? So that's page 191. I think we might need one more go at this. Oh, I don't know. How many more pages? Let's go into... Well, we'll go for it. Let's finish it off. It's off to work we go. For supper that evening, my grandmother had a plain omelette and 1 slice of bread. I had a piece of brown Norwegian goat's cheese, known as gejjotost. That's a difficult word to say. Which I had loved even when I was a boy. We ate it in front of the fire, my grandmother in her armchair and me on the table with my cheese on a small plate. Grandmama, I said, now that we have done away with the Grand High Witch, will all other witches in the world gradually disappear? I'm quite sure they won't, she answered. I stopped chewing and stared at her. But they must, I cried. Surely they must. I'm afraid not, she said. But if she's not there any longer, how are they going to get all the money they need? And who is going to give them orders and jazz them up to the annual meetings and invent all their magical formulas for them? When a queen bee dies, there is always another queen in the hive ready to take her place, my grandmother said. It's the same with witches. In the great headquarters where the Grand High Witch lives, there is always another Grand High Witch waiting in the wings to take over should anything happen. Oh no, I cried. That means everything we did was all for nothing. Have I become a mouse for nothing at all? We saved the children of England, she said. I don't call that nothing. I know, I cried, but that's not nearly good enough. I felt sure that all the witches of the world would slowly fade away after we had got rid of their leader. Now you tell me that everything is going to go on just the same as before. Not exactly as before, my grandmother said. For instance, there are no longer any witches in England. That's quite a triumph, isn't it? But what about the rest of the world, I cried. What about America and France and Holland and Germany? And what about Norway? You must not think I have been sitting back and doing nothing these last days, she said. I have been giving a great deal of thought and time to that particular problem. I was looking at her face when she said this, and all at once I noticed that a little secret smile was beginning to spread slowly around her eyes and the corners of her mouth. Why are you smiling, Grandmama? I asked. I have something rather interesting for you, she said. I have some rather interesting news for you, she said. What news? Shall I tell you right from the beginning? Yes, please, I said. I like good news. She had finished her omelette, and I had enough of my cheese. She wiped her lips with a napkin and said, As soon as we arrived back in Norway, I picked up the telephone and made a call to England. Who in England, Grandmama? To the chief police in Bournemouth, my darling. I told him I was the chief of police for the whole of Norway, and that I was interested in the peculiar happenings that had taken place recently in the Hotel Magnificent. Now hang on a sec, Grandmama, I said. There's no way an English policeman is going to believe that you are head of the Norwegian police. I am very good at imitating a man's voice, she said. Of course he believed me. The policeman in Bournemouth was honoured to get a call from the chief of police for the whole of Norway. So what did you ask him? I asked him for the name and address of the lady who had been living in room 454 in the Hotel Magnificent, the one who disappeared. You mean the Grand High Witch? I cried. Yes, my darling. And did he give it to you? Naturally he gave it to me. One policeman will always help another policeman. By golly, you've got a nerve, Grandmama. I wanted her address, my grandmother said. But did he know her address? He did indeed. They had found her passport in the room, and her address was in it. It was also in the hotel register. Everyone who stays in the hotel has to put a name and address in the book. But surely the Grand High Witch wouldn't have put her real name and address in the hotel register, I said. Why ever not, my grandmother said. Nobody in the world had the faintest idea who she was except the other witches. Wherever she went, people simply knew her as a nice lady. You, my darling, and you alone were the only non-witch ever to see her with her mask off. Even in her home district, in the village where she lived, people knew her as a kindly and very wealthy baroness who gave large sums of money to charity. I have checked up on that. I was getting exciting now. And that address you got, Grandmama, that must have been the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch. It still is, my grandmother said, and that will be where the new Grand High Witch is certain to be living this very moment with her retinue of special assistant witches. Important rulers are always surrounded by a large retinue of assistants. Where is her headquarters, Grandmama? I cried. Tell me where it is. It is a castle, my grandmother said, and the fascinating thing is that that castle will be all the names and addresses of all the witches in the world in that castle. How else could a Grand High Witch run her business? How else could she summon the witches of the various countries to their annual meetings? Where is the castle, Grandmama? I cried impatiently. What country? Tell me, quick. Guess, she said. Norway, I cried. Right first time, she answered. High up in the mountains above a small village. This was thrilling news. I did a little dance of excitement on the tabletop. My grandmother was getting pretty worked up herself, and now she heaved herself out of her chair and began pacing up and down the room, thumping the carpet with her stick. So we have work to do, you and I, she cried out. He looks happy, look. Jumping in the air. We have a great task ahead of us. Thank heavens you are a mouse. A mouse can go anywhere. All I have to do is put you down somewhere near the Grand High Witch's castle, and you will very easily be able to get inside and creep around looking and listening to your heart's content. I will, I answered. No one will ever see me. Moving about in a big castle will be child's play compared with going into a crowded kitchen full of cooks and waiters. You could spend days in there if necessary, my grandmother said. In her excitement, she was waving her stick all over the place, and suddenly she knocked over a tall and very beautiful vase that went crashing onto the floor and smashed into 1,000,000 pieces. Forget it, she said. It's only Ming. You could spend weeks in the castle if you wanted to, and they'd never know you were there. I myself would get a room in the village, and you could sneak out of the castle and have supper with me every night and tell me what's going on. I could, I cried out, and inside the castle I could go snooping around simply everywhere. But your main job, of course, my grandmother said, would be to destroy every witch in the place. That really would be the end of the whole organisation. Me destroy them, I cried, but how could I do that? Can't you guess, she said. Tell me, I said. Mouse maker, my grandmother shouted. Formula 86 delayed action mouse maker all over again. You will feed it to everyone in the castle by putting drops in their food. Do you remember the recipe? You do remember the recipe, don't you? Every bit of it, I answered. You mean we're going to make it ourselves? Why not? She cried. If they can make it, so can we. It's just a question of knowing what goes into it. Who's going to climb up all the trees to get the Gruntle's eggs? I asked her. I will, she cried. I'll do it myself. There's plenty of life in this old dog yet. I think I'd better do that part of it, Grandmama. You might come a cropper. Those are just details, she cried, waving back her stick again. We shall let nothing stand in our way. And what happens after that? I asked. After the new Grand High Witch and everyone else in the castle has been turned into mice. Then the castle will be completely empty and I shall come in and join you. Wait, I cried. Hold on, Grandmama. I've had a nasty thought. What nasty thought? She said. When the mouse maker turned me into a mouse, I said, I didn't become just any old ordinary mouse that you catch with the mouse traps. I became a talking, thinking, intelligent mouse person who wouldn't go near a mouse trap. My mother stopped dead in her tracks. She already knew what was coming next. Therefore, I went on, if we use the mouse maker to turn the Grand High Witch and all the other witches in the castle into mice, the whole place will be swarming with very clever, very nasty, very dangerous talking, thinking mouse witches. They'll all be witches in mouses' clothings. And that, I added, could be very horrible indeed. By golly, you're right, she cried. That never occurred to me. I couldn't possibly take on a castle full of mouse witches, I said. Nor could I, she said. They'd have to be got rid of at once. They'd have to be smashed and bashed and chopped up into little pieces exactly as they were in the Hotel Magnificent. I'm not doing that, I said. I couldn't anyways. I don't think you could either, Grandmama. And mousetraps wouldn't be the slightest use, by the way, I added. The Grand High Witch who did me in was wrong about mousetraps, wasn't she? Yes, my grandmother said impatiently, but I'm not concerned with that Grand High Witch. She's been chopped up long ago by the hotel chef. It's the new Grand High Witch we've got to deal with now, and the one up in the castle and all her assistants. A Grand High Witch is bad enough when she's disguised as a lady, but just think of what she could do if she was a mouse. She could go anywhere. I've got it, I shouted, leaping about a foot into the air. I've got the answer. Tell me, my grandmother snapped. The answer is cats, I shouted. Bring on the cats. My grandmother stared at me. Then a great grin spread over her face and she shouted, It's brilliant! Absolutely brilliant! Shove 6 cats into the castle, I cried, and they'll kill every mouse in the place in 5 minutes. I don't care how clever they are. You're a magician, my grandmother shouted, starting to wave her stick about once again. Look out for the vases, Grandmama. To heck with the vases, she shouted. I'm so thrilled I don't care if I break the lot. Just one thing, I said. You've got to make absolutely sure I'm well out of the way before you put the cats in. That's a promise, she said. What will we do after the cats have killed all the mice? I asked her. Page 200 coming up. They look excited. Look, there's the vase on the floor. I'll take back the cats to the village and then you and I will have the castle completely to ourselves. And then, I said, then we shall go through the records and get the names and addresses of all the witches in the whole world. And after that, I said, quivering with excitement, after that, my darling, the greatest task of all will begin for you and me. We shall pack our bags and go travelling all over the world. In every country we visit, we shall seek out the houses where the witches are living. We shall find each house one by one, and having found it, you will creep inside and leave your little drops of deadly mousemaker in the bread, or the cornflakes, or the rice pudding, or whatever food you see lying about. It will be a triumph, my darling, a colossal, unbeatable triumph. We shall do it entirely by ourselves, just you and me. That will be our work for the rest of our lives. My grandmother picked me up off the table and kissed me on the nose. "Oh my goodness me, we're going to be busy these next few weeks and months and years," she cried. I think we are, I said, "but what fun and excitement it's going to be." "You can say that again," my grandmother cried, giving me another kiss. "I can't wait to get started." And that's the end of it. Right, there's some more information about grandmother. The grandmother was based on Roald Dahl's mother, one of the most important influences in Roald's life. She was a wonderful storyteller and had an amazing memory for detail. Look at my fingers, Hugo. Dirty. Kitanai. Do you know why that is? I've been planting some vegetables in the garden. So at the back, you might just be able to see them in the corner. There they are. And I've made potatoes as well. And there's your apple tree, and the alliums are flowering. And tomorrow I'm going to put the beans in. And look at all the flowers on the strawberry plants that you helped plant. And there's all the bonsais. Your bonsai, I don't know if we can zoom in, but your bonsai is that one with the green and the orange in the middle. That's a great bonsai, that one. We found that in Stannington Road. And there's some conker tree which we picked together, and the fig tree, and there's a car's roses, and a car planted those other plants in the corner, and then there's right in the corner at the back there is an Australian plant. Okay, well, the sun's going down because it's Nene time soon. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that book. That's another book down. So we've done Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and then The Witches. And there's lots of books on your MP3 player. If they're from audio, not video ones. You can really listen to those. And that's it, really. I love you lots and I hope you enjoyed it. And I have to think what to read next. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.